In this video, we're going to be talking about IAM roles, which are sets of permissions that grant access to actions and resources in AWS. These permissions are attached to the role, not to an IAM user or group, and can be used by the following. The first example is an IAM user in the same AWS account as the role. But roles can also be used by IAM users in different AWS accounts as the role. And finally, they can be used by web services such as EC2. Now, bear in mind that roles can also be used by an external user authenticated by an external identity provider, but that's going to be outside of the scope of this course. Now, there are several supplemental types of IAM roles, and the first is an AWS service role, which is a role that a service assumes to perform actions in your account on your behalf. When you set up most AWS service environments, you have to define a role for the service to assume. This role must include all the permissions required for the service to access the AWS resources that it needs. Service roles vary from service to service, but many allow you to choose your permissions as long as you meet the documented requirements for that service. Service roles provide access only within your account and cannot be used to grant access to services in other accounts. You can create, modify, and delete a service role from within the IAM management console. There are also service roles for an EC2 instance, which is a special type of service role that a service assumes to launch an Amazon EC2 instance that runs your application. This role is assigned to the EC2 instance when it's launched. AWS automatically provides temporary security credentials that are attached to the role and then makes them available for the EC2 instance to use on behalf of its applications. Shortly here, we're going to go into an example on how to create service roles for EC2s, but in the meantime, finally there's service-linked roles, which are a unique type of service role that are linked directly to an AWS service. Service-linked roles are predefined by the service and include all the permissions that the service requires to call other AWS services on your behalf. The linked service also defines how you create, modify, and delete a service-linked role. A service might automatically create or delete the role. It might allow you to create, modify, or delete the role as part of a wizard or a process in the service. Or it might require that you use IAM to create or delete the role. Regardless of the method, service-linked roles make setting up a service easier because you don't have to manually add the necessary permissions. With that said, let's take a closer look at IAM roles in our AWS dashboard. So we'll click on Services, and then find IAM. Next, we'll click on Roles, and we're going to create a new role here in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at some of the roles that are in this account. So the first one, AWS Service Role for Autoscaling. What it does is this default service-linked role that enables access to AWS services and resources used or managed by autoscaling. But what I want to point out here are the trusted entities. So this role is only trusted by the autoscaling AWS service. And similarly, all of these have trusted entities. For example, the AWS service role for organizations can only be used by the organization's AWS service. For now though, let's create a new role. So if you recall, there were several types of trusted entities that you can attach to a user. The first, of course, is AWS service. So if we wanted, we could choose a specific AWS service to be the trusted entity that can use this role. You can also choose another AWS account. So if you want to provide access to a specific role to another AWS account, then you would do that here by setting the account ID. Next, we have web identity. So if you wanted to federate access to this role using identity providers like Amazon Cognito, Facebook, or Google, then you could do that here. And finally, if you ever need to federate access through your corporate directory, then you can use SAML 2.0 federation here. But for now, we're going to stick with an AWS service. So this example role that we're going to create is going to be accessible to EC2 instances. So let's choose the EC2 service and go to Permissions. This page is going to look really familiar because this is the page that contains all of our AWS accounts managed policies. And that includes both AWS managed policies and our managed policies, or policies that we've created. So for example, I can look for the policy that I created in a previous video here. You also have the option to create a new policy and use it here if you'd like, but we're going to skip that for now. For now, just as an example, let's say I want to give an EC2 permission to manage every AWS resource. Then I would select Administrator Access here, and then go to Review. For the role name, we'll just call this Admin for EC2, and then click Create Role. And that's all there is to it. So now we have a role called Admin for EC2 with a trusted entity of EC2, meaning only EC2 instances can assume this role. And if we were to click on the role, then you'll see under Permissions, it has Administrator Access, which means any EC2 instance that's allowed to assume this role is going to have Administrator Access on this account. And you know what? It's not exactly within the scope of this IAM module, but let's go ahead and apply that role to an EC2 instance just for fun here. So Services and EC2, and then Running Instances. So let's choose my first instance. If we wanted to assign a role to this instance, then we'd go to Action, Instance Settings, and attach a Replace IAM role. And you'll notice when we click this drop-down open, we see our role, Admin for EC2. So if we were to select this and then hit Apply, then that role would be applied to that instance. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this video. So if that makes sense, then feel free to move on.